Good evening, everybody. My name is Tansen Sen. I'm the director of the Center for Global Asia, and I welcome you to the first event in this academic year for the center. I'm very honored to have Marina Kaneti give the first talk. This is not necessarily about China, but mostly about Southeast Asia. Earlier this summer, or was it August, I gave a talk at the LKY school, Marina's class on the Silk Road, on the Maritime Silk Road. So I invited Marina to talk about beyond the Maritime Silk Road. Marina is an assistant professor at the LKY school at National University of Singapore. I know Marina since she was a kid, right? When she was doing doing her doing her PhD at the New School in New York. We worked together at a place called India China Institute. After graduating from after finishing her doctoral degree from New School, she has been working in Singapore. Our postdoc Asif is also from LKY school, actually. But her talk will be for 45-50 minutes. We'll have Q&A after that, and you are welcome to participate. My students who are here for extra credit, I expect you to write a good report on that. And those of you who are online, if you have questions after the talk, please raise your digital hand, and I'll ask you to ask the questions, or you can also type in your questions in the Zoom chat box, right? So please join me in welcoming Marina to our new campus. She has been to the old campus, but this is to a new campus. So welcome, Marina.
Thank you. Thank you, Tansen, and thank you so much for having me for the first lecture of this semester. It's a great privilege to be here. Tansen didn't say the most important thing, that the title of my talk today was his invention. So if I don't speak directly to the title, it's his fault. But I'm here to talk to you about a very different way of thinking about both the Maritime Silk Road and thinking about heritage and what it all means for all of us in this digital age. As we are all aware, the world is rapidly changing because of AI, and how we engage in heritage, in history, in knowing what the world looks like is quite different in this new age. So I will try to tie up all these different strands together in my talk today. Maybe not. Maybe this is not working. So I will have to do this. Maybe not. Hold on. Oh, okay. Maybe now it's working. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So those of you who are familiar with the Maritime Silk Road and with the Silk Road in general are probably also quite familiar with this map. This is a map produced by UNESCO. It precedes everything that China is doing in the moment on the Maritime Silk Road, the 21st century Silk Road. But you can see already the extent to which China is part of the Silk Road story, right? All the lines, all the connectivities go between China to Europe, from Europe to China. And this is usually the story that we are told when we are talking about the Silk Roads, whether we are talking about the land route or the maritime route. And of course, there are a lot of scholars who work on either the land or the maritime route. For my presentation today, I will mostly be focusing on the maritime understanding of heritage and where it fits with the Maritime Silk Road and where maybe we can think beyond the current expressions of Maritime Silk Road. Now, if we talk about, oops, the wrong button. If we talk about Maritime Silk Road from the perspective of China, and of course, Tansen is the leading scholar on this. This is the person that he works on, right? This picture of Zheng He is actually from the Shanghai Maritime Museum, that's not too far from here. If you haven't been, oh, okay, lecture's over. Questions? Uh, okay, not too far from here, but relatively far. Yeah, not as far as Singapore. But of course, the story that you hear from the maritime Silk Route recreation of the official narratives very much involves Zheng He. And of course, there are different stories associated with Zheng He's travels, his diplomatic missions, what he has done across the world. In the previous map that I showed you, again, the maritime route very much tracks a lot of the places that he has visited. So if you are familiar with the Maritime Silk Road in the current narrative of it, you are probably quite familiar with the story already. If not, you have to read everything that Tansen has written on this. This is another snapshot, again, from that same museum that also shows you in a comparative perspective what the Chinese ships at the time looked like compared to the ships that were designed and used by Europeans. And so, again, to sort of position the story of Zheng He and China's involvement with the Maritime Silk Road in a different perspective. So how can we think about this from a political standpoint? For me, as a scholar of politics, this is all about prestige, a way in which you create a narrative, a historical narrative, a heritage narrative, which is about prestige. And what is prestige? Prestige is something far more important than power, because it is the everyday currency of international relations. What other people think about you is far more important than the type of weapons that you have or what kind of power you might exercise over others. It's how others accept you in the world. And yes, I'm quoting here some international relations scholars when they talk about prestige, but actually people have been talking about prestige forever. Right? This is in the ancient world, they were talking about glory. How do you get to that point of glory? And how all your activities as part of the community are driven towards glory. So glory, prestige is all about you being recognized by others in the world. So heritage, I would like to say, is a big part of this story of prestige. And again, if you are familiar with heritage conversations, particularly in the context of UNESCO heritage, you will know that there is quite a competition going on in the recognition of heritage sites. So as you can see on this kind of crude map, you kind of cannot see Europe pretty much because everything is covered by heritage designated sites, right? So from the perspective of civilization, from the perspective of thinking whose civilization is the most important, the biggest, the best in the world, right? The Europeans have kind of positioned themselves very prominently there. Definitely, there are some countries in Asia that I will not mention by name that are also trying very hard to become part of this nomination process and to have their sites, their heritage designated as UNESCO heritage. Again, as a scholar of politics, to me, this is all a story about how you talk about your prestige. And it's important to think about this because the UNESCO nomination is recognized around the world. So it's not something that, oh, only in Europe is recognized or only in the United States. So anyway, again, a story about prestige. But is this enough? And how do we get to these stories about what counts, what is important to think about prestige? How do we get to this, especially when we think about maritime heritage, when we think about the Silk Road? how do we get to deciding what should count as heritage, what should count as something that the whole world needs to recognize? Well, if we talk about the Maritime Silk Road, the story, obviously, of the Maritime Silk Road does not start with China. Before China, and again, you need to read Tansen's work on this, Japan was very active in sort of saying, you know what, the Silk Road starts, the Maritime Silk Road, all the Silk Roads start with us, right? So they also have very prominently created sites that show how they are connected to the Silk Road. Um, in India, they don't call this Silk Road. They have come up with another name. But again, what they're trying to say is, you know what, we are so connected to the rest of the world. And what matters is how India is positioned in this Indian Ocean world and how important it is for anybody who travels, whether it's from east to west or from west to east, to go through India. And that all of these connections that have been developed are centered on India, right? So the Indian heritage becomes very prominent in this other narrative. If you go to Singapore, where I'm currently based, well, they do something different. They just buy artifacts to say, we're actually very well positioned also in this maritime world. We have central role to play, and we continue playing this central role because we have a lot of money, right? So how do they do that? They, for example, buy out an entire shipwreck. They give the shipwreck a particular name and say we are very central in this maritime story that can be said, can be told. Indonesia, of course, does not stay back from this, right? So they also want to be part of this maritime heritage narrative. Again, not calling it a Silk Road. Actually, they call it a spice route in their version. And as soon as China came out with their maritime Silk Road narrative around 2013, the Indonesian government said, you know what, we need to develop a national cultural strategy that is focused on the maritime fulcrum, and we need to show the world how important we are in this maritime conversation. And by the way, when the previous president at the time, in 2015, when he gave his inaugural speech, he gave it from the top of a boat. Right? So again, very symbolic to show the prestige of Indonesia in the context of maritime heritage. Is this the whole story though? Right? So we can look at different countries, we can see how these countries try to appropriate some understanding of maritime heritage, perhaps redefine it, argue whether we are talking about silk, whether we are talking about spices, whether it's cotton, but is there more to the story of maritime heritage, and what might that look like? So I want to take you very quickly on a kind of a little bit of a journey into what exactly was happening if we accept this idea that there is connectivity happening across Europe and Asia and across the Indian Ocean world. What exactly does that look like? What are we talking about? So this is a snapshot from a museum in Singapore, actually, with four very prominent travelers, ancient Tansen, do you know who these who is Ibn Battuta? Which one? No, that's Marco Polo. Yeah. The one on the very left, no, the one over there, that's your left? Okay, the furthest over there is Marco Polo. Yes, of course, Tansen recognizes Zhenghe, although that's not the original one. The one next to Zhenghe is actually Ibn Battuta. And of course, because this is in Singapore, you have Sang Nila Utama, the person who saw a lion and said, oh, this island should be called Singapura, right? So you have four very prominent travelers, discoverers, who are usually associated with the maritime history, with the history of discovery. So what were they doing, all these travelers? They were usually traveling from some parts of Europe into some parts of Asia, usually for the purposes of getting spices. And we know from historical records that for a very long time, the Europeans actually had no way, they did not know how to get to India or to the Southeast Asian islands. They had to rely on on Arab merchants for their spices and everything else that they want to buy. And there are many very funny stories of the Arabs actually telling them fantastic stories of how difficult it is to get cinnamon because they wanted a higher price for the cinnamon. So usually this is what would happen. They would travel from Europe into India, and that's one version of a maritime travel, right? This is another version of a maritime travel where you don't just want to go from Europe through Africa into Southeast Asia, but you actually go the other way around. And this happened when the Portuguese and the Spanish did not have a very good relation with each other. So the Spanish decided they need to find another way to travel, right? Because the Portuguese had already occupied certain routes. So the story of kind of the maritime travel that we know from the European records, and that's important, and I'll return to this, is all about how the Europeans try to connect to these other regions. And this is what we usually talk about when we talk about maritime travel. But other than a map, what does this story look like? So I'll give you a very short piece from Magellan's voyages. And this map here that I showed you is actually Magellan's journey that he did not finish, because what happened to Magellan? He died, he was killed. He was killed in the Philippines, right? So not such a positive story of travel, right? There's a little bit of a hiccup, but the hiccup is not just him being killed, it's also what the journey looked like. So for 3 months, they were eating, first they were eating biscuits, and when there were no biscuits, they were just eating the leftovers that were full of worms. The water that they were drinking was yellow, and frequently had sawdust in that water. And also the rats were extremely expensive, and they were paying quite a lot of money if they could get rats so that they can eat the rats. So what am I telling you here? I'm telling you that it's not just getting to the ground that's very difficult and challenging and you might get killed, but also the journeys themselves were very gruesome and it was very difficult to travel. So perhaps there is another story to be told when we are talking about maritime travel and the type of heritage that we want to talk about. So why is that? Because whether you're looking at ancient maps, right? So one is an Arabic map and the other is a version that a student of mine tried to put together. Actually, the world does not look like land mostly. It's ocean mostly. Most of the time you're on the ocean, and if you're traveling, right, from one endpoint to another, it becomes a very gruesome journey where maybe you need to stop at different places and ask for resources. So what kind of story would that give us? So I want to talk to you about this other story of maritime travel. So this other story of maritime travel is the story of hospitality. Basically, there would not be maritime travel without hospitality. Because maybe you can survive for a few months on biscuits and on rats, But still, by the time you get to land, unless people feed you, give you clothes, and nourish you back to health, your travel is over, right? So one of the things that's very important, and this is the type of research that I've been doing, is to try to understand the practices of hospitality, especially in the Indian Ocean world. And pretty much in every maritime community around the Indian Ocean world, there are different expressions that go something like the guest is God, or the guest is the most important person, the guest is king. This is usually the expressions of hospitality that exist in these communities. Hospitality, in this sense, is care. You care for the people, irrespective of whether they're strangers, whether they're kings, whether they're commoners. They're people that you need to take care of, because when they come to your community, they're as important as the gods. So maritime heritage as hospitality is important because this is the only way that you can connect. This is the only way in which the networks, the maritime networks, can survive. That there is a way in which your travel will actually lead to where you want to go and to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish. At the same time, this hospitality is a reciprocal relationship. There is something that the local populations get from you. So Ibn Battuta has a lot of these passages in his work where he talks about how he was received because the local chiefs wanted to find out news of other communities. They wanted to know what's happening in other parts of the world. Right? So this was also a way for communities to signal to others that this is a good place for you to stop. This is a good place to replenish the provisions that you want. Obviously, you don't go where Magellan was killed, because a little more complicated there, right? But places that wanted to be on the prestige map would have to be hospitable places, right? Where you will be received, where others will take care of you. And by the way, what's the difference in my hospitality already compared to what I was showing you until now? What changed in my images? Not Tansen. Tansen is speaking too much. What changed? Hmm? Until now, I was showing you men. So we're moving into a different world. Right? Hmm? Well, I moved too fast. You're ruining it for me already. All right. So hospitality, as I mentioned, is very much associated with prestige. Many civilizations defined their understanding of prestige through the codes of hospitality, right? Ancient civilizations. The idea that only the civilized know how to receive a stranger properly, right? This goes from ancient European traditions through the ancient Indian Ocean world traditions. And this is how you host the rest of the world. You host ambassadors, scholars, goods, imperial courts, universities are the places of hospitality. This is the criteria of prestige that you establish. Port cities are cities of hospitality. This is where you can welcome others and exchange and receive from others. And the reason why all of this is associated with women is because in a lot of these communities, women were the ones who will make the decisions, the everyday decisions, the economic decisions on what kind of resources are available for the purposes of hosting these strangers. And that is also because a lot of the communities, the maritime communities, were matrilineal. And we have a lot of archives that indicate that all the decisions about money, all the decisions about trade, all of the decisions about trade networks were made by women. So hospitality was very gendered in a way in which it was mostly connected to women. And through the women also, all these travelers could get into the local networks, whether it's for the purposes of spices, whether it's for the purposes of cotton or anything else. And again, we don't have too many images, or maybe we do, I don't know. There are some art scholars here who might be able to help me with this, so that we can recover understanding of the place of women in the maritime tradition. But yes, there are here and there a lot of images, a lot of stories of how hospitality was very much associated with women and how women played a prominent role in this. So what is then in hospitality? The power and prestige to have a relationship with others, the opportunity to develop identity and culture that is built around welcome, right? The opportunity to show and to signal the care and provision of resources, and the opportunity for development and evolution of these maritime communities. A lot of that network, a lot of these dynamics suffered a major change with the coming of the Europeans into the Indian Ocean world. There are many scholars who have talked about how a lot of the matrilineal communities, how the position of women was challenged at that time. But again, a lot of these scholars don't talk about the place that women played and the role of hospitality itself in developing these maritime traditions. Why hospitality matters, and why does maritime heritage need to think about hospitality? Because heritage is not only material. So yes, we can talk about ships, we can talk about uh, guns, we can talk about uh, spices, we can talk about cotton, but there is a performative and ethical dimension to heritage that is missing a lot of times from the conversation of the past and how we also think about prestige. And so there is a different way in which, if we want to understand the non-material heritage, there's a different way in which we need to start thinking about what we know and how we know about the past, and what type of knowledge production exists in the world today. Why is it, for example, that we don't remember the traditions of hospitality? Why is it that we don't know about the position of women in these traditions? And by the way, the map that you see here is a little bit of an attempt by the Indonesian government to identify hospitality traditions across Indonesia, across the 15,000 islands that Indonesia has. Because again, that's the only way in which you can keep connections, keep relationship, right? Indonesia was not one thing, one entity for most of the history of that maritime world. So where is hospitality and women in maritime heritage? Non-existent. I had a student of mine look through all the Silk Road books that are written over the past 20 years. Maybe 2-3 books have a little bit about women. Maybe there's a chapter here and there on women. And most of the time when women are discussed, they're discussed as prostitutes. I'm sorry for the online audience, right? So most of the conversation that we have about the past, maritime past, not only not focused on hospitality, definitely not focused on women. So we have a masculine discovery narrative and representations of global connectivity. There's textual omission, visual omission. That is also in a way factually incorrect because a lot of the archives talk about the role of women in the ancient maritime world. And what I'm sharing with you here, thinking about the system of knowledge production and where we are moving in into this digital world, is a bunch of databases that I have quickly looked through in order to find out whether or not there's information on hospitality as part of the work, and to what extent there are gender data in these databases. Well, first of all, I have to say that these databases are entirely not interoperable. They speak in different ways, so you can't even put them together in a large language model in order to create actually a good understanding of what's happening in the maritime world. So that's already a problem. And then, of course, there's very little on gender dimensions. There's very little on hospitality traditions, which I think is very important if we want to talk about maritime heritage. So what is prioritized in these databases? European ships, commodities, ports, at the same time, not much information on informal uh, practices on women, on non-elite coastal populations. There's very little on religious and ritual traditions, which are also often associated with heritage, with hospitality traditions, and the civilizational value, right, of hospitality, of as part of heritage, part of prestige, is also missing. So what can we say about the current state, and why are we talking about the current state? If we have these databases that tell us about the ancient world, we know that these are the databases that are now fed into AI models to create knowledge about the world that we live in. Right? So what's in the databases? Colonial technocratic knowledge about shipwrecks, about port registers, about trade ledgers. Right? There's hard data on coordinates, on GPS scans, not much on oral, on ritual, on ecological knowledge. And most of the databases that we have are in global north institutions, usually difficult to access from anywhere in the global south. And a lot of the Asian and African data sets that exist appear as inputs rather than epistemic equals, right? Having the same type of statue, same type of significance in the database world. With this, how do we think about prestige? If this is what the databases are telling us, then how do we think about prestige? Prestige is about the shipwrecks, about the treasure cargoes, the imperial ports. It's not about the everyday interactions. It's not about the memories. It's not about the hospitality traditions. It's not about the practices of local communities. This is delegitimized as part of the folklore, right? So it's even in the Indonesia database that I shared with you, these are dances, right? This is not hospitality that made the identity of these communities. And so these digitization projects that compete for attention and create the global narratives do not focus on local significance and do not focus on transboundary practices, which, again, in order to think about these transboundary practices, you cannot think about them without thinking about hospitality. So maritime heritage is the architecture of prestige, right? It's and part of this architecture of prestige is because hospitality is an essential part of thinking about recognition of status, of not just who holds power and who produces knowledge, but also about generosity, about being able to care and interact with others. And to the extent that hospitality is invisible in this infrastructure of connectivity, we are not able to understand and think about the knowledge of the past that is very important in thinking of how people have been connected with each other. So just to conclude, when we think about power, prestige, and knowledge production, and we want to include hospitality in this conversation, this other story about the maritime past, we need to, first of all, understand that hospitality is decidedly non-masculine and perhaps also non-traditional family-oriented. Because again, in a lot of the maritime communities, if the men were the ones who would travel from one place to another, it was the women who would be making major decisions on what the community does in terms of hospitality. It is also important to think and understand that there is a different conceptualization, a different way of understanding what is the relationship between hosts and guests, particularly in a world where actually a lot of people are telling us that countries have to close and not welcome others. Right? So the extent to which the welcoming of others is actually what allows for connection, allows us to be together, and hospitality is what makes that possible. Perhaps this is another reason why we need to recover this knowledge, right? Make sure that the idea of care is something that we know happened in the past and also carry it for the future. So also, care is not contingent on a public-private divide, meaning that you don't just care for people in your home, away from others. This is part of the public expression. This is how we show to the rest of the world what makes us human, what makes us people. And also this is important because when we think about maritime travel, and you saw this with Magellan's quote, the interaction that happens in maritime travel, the interaction that happens in our world, involves non-human agents, involves Mother Nature or winds or whatever else you want to call it. Right? So there are other forces in the world that don't necessarily depend on us. And our way, the response in which we are able to deal with this is through hospitality. It is through care, right? Only when we care for others, we know that maybe they will care for us when we are in a similar situation. Again, that's a very prominent philosophy of a lot of the islands on the across the Indian Ocean world. And finally, the erasure of women as an erasure, not just of the gendered relationship of the maritime world, but also an erasure of the centrality of care and hospitality in the world that we live in. So yes, we can talk about the maritime travelers, but to kind of borrow a quote from a famous book, the title of which is Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, right? Who made sure that these travelers can actually continue on their journeys? So my final slide for you is that if we want to think about hospitality as part of this maritime tradition, this also allows us to think about how knowledge is produced, not from the vantage point of extraction, right? Because if you think about the maritime heritage world that we know and talk about, there's an extractive aspect of it. You're taking spices, you're taking silk, you're engaging in power relations, you go from one place or another, you impose your political system on other people, you extract from them the things that you need for your trade purposes. Hospitality provides us with a different way of thinking about this and perhaps creating a different knowledge system where we don't talk about exploitation and control, but we talk about relation. We talk about care. We talk about encounter that respects and builds on what others can give us in this interaction. So recovering this way of knowing challenges not just how we do research, how we do trade, how we do education, but also it's an opportunity to reposition care and relations as a primary source of knowledge and an understanding of what makes us human. And I think this becomes even more important in a world where we're trying to redefine ourselves in opposition of a non-human agent such as an AI system. Thank you very much.
You need something? Thank you, Marina. By the way, Chung He was a eunuch. Um, so I don't know about his masculinity as such, but maybe we need a category for that. There were lots of eunuchs traveling. But I'm teaching a course on the Silk Road, and you are absolutely right. In the course, there's nothing about women and their role in the connectivities across overland and maritime routes. And hospitality is an intervention, I think, methodological intervention in not just talking about men and objects and ideas, but also the contribution of women in these long distance travels. I think that's a very, very innovative way of looking at it and pushes us into finding ways to understand the human and woman's role in these connections. I was in Indonesia, and in Semarang, there is actually a temple for Changhe, and one of the shrines is actually for his cook, a female cook, who accompanied Changhe on the travels. So I'm sure there are these female who are traveling on the ships, but nobody wants to talk about them, unfortunately. But the floor is open for questioning on the Zoom. If you want to type in your questions, or if anybody wants to ask a question, my students are required to ask questions. Landry, start preparing your question if you have one. Anybody else? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your excellent speech. I really learned quite a lot. I found like the maritime heritage is finally not just a heritage concept, it's something more. It to me it just sounds like an anthropology research or something. So my question is related to your methodology. So if the maritime heritage or heritage is a contemporary world, the maritime thing happened before. So how did you do your research? If it's come to the ethnography or something, so how do you do your research to the contemporary people and things and objects? So how it just something past and present and come together in your field work? So it's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Shall I answer? Thank you. This is an extremely important question, and it's a very difficult question because, and this is part of the reason why I'm doing this work, because a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the understanding of hospitality, the role of women is pretty much erased, right? We don't have that much information on this. So I try to combine methods, definitely going around and talking to local communities, what their hospitality traditions are, asking them if they have terminology on hospitality, sort of extracting language understanding of hospitality from different places. At the same time, I use a lot of visuals, particularly ancient visuals, works of art that show you very prominently how women are interacting in spaces of ports, marketplaces, um, serving food and drinks to guests, things like that, right? So this is the type of work that I try to link, both from a language perspective and also from a visual perspective. And of course, if you look at Chinese and Arab archives, there are records as well of the role of women quite prominently, particularly as traders. So yeah, it's a long process. Yeah. And hopefully, right, this is one of the reasons why I want this story to not just be my story, um, is because I feel that as we move into a world of AI digitization, where digitization is all that counts, if the archives are already quite lacking information, what will be digitized becomes even more important. So how can we recover this knowledge of a different type of interaction? So Zhenghe sounds like a good place to start.
Tianhu and Mazu are female.
Yes.
So when they act as sorry, you were going to ask that question?
Thank you, Marina, for this fascinating talk, especially introducing women into this very grand, male-oriented global connectivity story. I think I think I have a question about like I really like this feminist rereading and reframing of hospitality as sort of displaced female labor. But I also wonder, how do we tell the story of female labor and agency when there are also like this nuanced stories of female enslavement and sexual exploitation? So how do we tell this story, and how do we craft the line between like who is hospitable and who is consumable?
Yeah. Uh, Again, very important question. And I think this is part of the reason why a lot of the hospitality story was lost, because that line between care, right? Different understandings of care, care and hospitality, and the perception of what a woman is supposed to do and not do in society varies quite a lot. It varied quite a lot. If you look at stories from Portuguese and Dutch travelers going into Southeast Asia and describing how the females would jump on top of them and they feel so significant and powerful because of that. Whereas in a lot of the local traditions, this was probably one part of a hospitality tradition, right? Where you take care of a person in various ways, right? Physical needs, emotional needs, other needs. And so that division, a line that was established very prominently by the Europeans as to what is permissible, what is civilized, also created these different categories of what females can and can do, what is proper and what is improper, right? So a lot of these understandings of female propriety, unfortunately, were very much imposed by the Europeans in this context. Doesn't mean there was no enslavement and things like that, but the moral part of this was very crucially imposed by the Europeans.
Hello. Oh, hello. Yeah. It's very interesting. Okay, thank you for the wonderful speech. It's very interesting for me to stumble upon this uh seminar because I'm actually an insider for the topic you are researching on, but I'm a modern day maritime practice. So because I'm ship owner, um, and we are hosting an event for all the ASEAN and China ship owners, and the title I chose was Maritime Silk Road for a New Era. And then when I was doing a bit of research on whether this is an appropriate name for the title, and this seminar popped up, so I just clicked, and registered. So a little bit of a little bit question that I had regarding what you just said in the lecture was that you mentioned a lot about the woman, the absence of woman's presence in the maritime, which is true because when you were talking about in a narrow definition of considering vessels or management of vessels or the presence of women is very limited because a lot of the labor that is constrained by our physique abilities. So a lot of the labor, especially in ancient times, would have to be, I would say, men. But modern times, I think it's still, not changed very much. But the interesting thing is, I think a lot of times we seem to ignore the management of maritime Silk Road or just maritime in general is that the woman comes into more management places. For example, the ASEAN ship owner community, the chairman is a woman. And a lot of the ship owner associations, if you have done a little bit of research, are women as well, and starting to emerge. And this is a bit of different, but I still see a little bit of a disconnection between the practice, say the vessels on the vessels, or the yard or, of these vessels, or uh, the how to say the front line of this industry is very much the same, with its ancient practices. So I also want to know what's your what's your projection of the ancient maritime practice into modern world, and have you been following the recent changes or the connection between the two? And also, before I get back to the family business, I was also a researcher. I do research in business school, so I know the limitation of research sometimes constrained by language because a lot of times the language we do research on are probably in English, apart from your own language, and that the universal language would be English. So could that limit, our perspectives or the knowledge, other things that we know about this general topic? That's my question. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. These are amazing questions, and I feel there are quite a few questions that you asked. Let me start with the language question because I think it's very important to address this. Most of the ancient records that exist on maritime travel are not in English. Maybe not until the 17th century, I would say, when the British became a naval power. And so if we want to think about ancient practices, definitely English will not be the language to engage with. There are some of the European languages that are important: Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, definitely Arabic, Turkish, the ancient version of the Turkish language, and of course Chinese. But again, you might say even this is not sufficient, because if we're talking about Southeast Asia, none of these languages necessarily represent Southeast Asia. And perhaps the same thing if we're talking about the Indian Ocean world of the eastern coast of Africa, right? So again, other languages. The extent to which we become limited because of languages is very important once again today, when a lot of the work done in digital repositories happens to be in English. So it's a double loss, if you will, right? We not only lose understanding of what's happening in the ancient world because we're limited to a few languages where things have been recorded, but also the loss again today when a lot of the processing of data happens in maybe 2, 3 dominant languages. So that's on the language side. I love your question about the connection between the past and the present in terms of how do we see women reposition perhaps in the modern story of the maritime. And I guess I would love to talk to you more to understand how women are doing this, because that could be definitely a next part of this research, and to sort of think of how maybe some of these connections have always been there, but we are not looking at them because in general, we discount the presence of women in the maritime stories. So thank you for this.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. So I got two questions. First is also concerning about the methodology. So you have mentioned about the intangible heritage, where certain ways like the disappearing of these materials has made like some of the stories or discussion of hospitality delegitimized as folklore, which belongs to the category of intangible heritage we're talking about nowadays. So I wonder, would you consider, or if it's part of your approach, thinking about the recent development of intangible heritage in theory, in theoretical discussion, and also in practice, does that like help or not, or does it like, would it shed light on such kind of project in the future? And before the talk we mentioned about, I really want to learn more about the Maritime Silk Road because of my teaching on Silk Road studies. I also have another course on intangible heritage. So I'm definitely going to include this case to the students. It's just like a wonderful perspective. Then the second question is more about like thinking about how we define the recipient or the person or the women engaged or to become the one who show hospitality, because we have the more examples about the kind of European travelers arriving in Southeast Asia. But when we're talking about a maritime Silk Road, actually involving more kind of culture, Arabic world, and also it's not like just like a one direction. It's often like shifting between different or traveling between different continents, places. So for example, Quanzhou, if Quanzhou in China becomes such a place and you have travelers around the world, then would like women or like also the non-human or in general the natural things in Quanzhou become also the subject of hospitality if we have certain kind of sources? Or to put it simple, like do we how we think about the kind of power structure of different cultures or so in the definition of the actor or agency of women or the one who show hospitality. So yeah, this is a two question. Thank you.
Yeah, very complex questions. What was the first one? Intangible heritage. You know, I think it's quite difficult when we work with intangible heritage and in thinking about the categories of intangible heritage to actually be able to capture the perspective of communities. So when I work in Indonesia, a lot of times what I struggle with and try to work with my interlocutors on the ground is that they always describe heritage in kind of 2 dimensions, which usually doesn't kind of enter the records, kind of the official world categories and records of heritage. they think of heritage as heritage for the others that you can tell others, and then heritage that's for themselves. That's the sacred heritage, the one that you don't share with outsiders, because it cannot be commercialized. It cannot be part of some, I don't know, touristy UNESCO or other initiative, right? That's actually the heritage that's most important, the oral traditions, the histories that they pass from generation to generation and that they consider sacred. So if I want to talk about their intangible heritage and I'm only stuck with, oh, this is a Balinese dance, or this is, how we give Bito to as part of our hospitality tradition, then I'm only seeing the outer layer of what they want to present rather than understanding the traditions that matter to them. And so intangible heritage feels a little bit like an onion that we need to keep peeling in order to understand and maybe also to know the limits of what we want to expose and not expose, right? So that becomes part of the challenge in thinking about intangible heritage. Not to mention, right, in a lot of, and again, Indonesia is the example that comes to mind most closely. A lot of the heritage traditions of the islands were wiped out because the people were wiped out in a lot of the communities. Or if there's anything record staying, comes from the Dutch. Right? So to the extent that a lot of the communities there know about their history, they know it from Dutch archives. So again, the knowledge production process is not new, right? It's not just a 21st century dilemma with AI. There are certain ways in which knowledge has already been shaped and produced for a very long time. And the type of intangible heritage that was, I guess, put into the Dutch repositories is also in itself challenging. And that's probably true for a lot of communities that were colonized. Sorry, there was a second question. Mm. Yeah, yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so overall, I would say that for the time being, we don't have hospitality as, right. So part of this project is to reconnect prestige and hospitality, to sort of argue that that has been part of a global tradition of interaction that has been lost. Um, so whether or not this was in the past was part of how Quanzhou versus Zanzibar was considering themselves is perhaps part of that project as well. To understand actually with the help of others, because at the end of the day, I'm just one person. This is a interdisciplinary work, right? To understand with the help of others um, where the understanding of prestige of Quanzhou, of Zanzibar, of places in other parts of the world, how this idea of prestige was constructed, and whether or not hospitality was a major point in that thinking. Right?
David online. Go ahead. We can't hear you.
Maybe he can type the question.
You're breaking up. Maybe you can type the question. Yeah, you're breaking up. Can you type your question? No, it doesn't work. Can you type your question? Um, as he types, Marina, I mentioned Mao Tzu and Tianho, but also Kuan Yin is somebody who is venerated by people traveling on the seas. So there is a female presence as far as spiritual support is concerned, right? For the travelers.
Yeah.
I'm sure the Europeans also had female deities. Maybe that's one way of also adding to your research. It's not necessarily hospitality, but protection. And how come the protective deities are mostly female?
Right.
And then you can of course trace some of the temples dedicated to these deities. So you have some recognition that female protective deities play a role in the travel. So what is absent are the actual woman, right? I mean, there is a presence of woman spiritually. So I think maybe we have to differentiate the two and try to understand why the men are interested in venerating female deities to protect them on the sea travel, but the role of actual woman gets unrecognized.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for the Europeans, as you might know, a lot of their ships, usually the mast was a woman, right? So again, the protection of the woman on the sea. A lot of the boats had women's names as well. So again, this idea of protection, and thank you for bringing that up, is very important part of it. So again, I don't know whether they really discounted women so much, or perhaps the knowledge of this was erased. That they were, as you said, the cook for Junko was a woman, but we wouldn't know that
He had
because
both male and female
yeah,
cooks, so he ate a lot. Um,
and he was a eunuch,
yeah, he
so
was a
you know
eunuch.
we can't count it against him.
Yeah,
But but yeah, there's definitely parts of the story that seem to be missing,
yeah, yeah.
and things that we could try
Yeah, and
to
the other
connect the
part
dots with.
also missing is endangered labor women, right? I mean,
Mm.
these were endangered women traveling or
Yeah.
taken to Caribbeans or Africa, and their experiences on ships and also reaching
For sure.
all these plantations. I
Yeah.
think is quite important. It's not that they are providing hospitality, but they are taken as labor. I think one of the questions that
Yeah.
Yitung had was about that the traveling woman. Uh, I mean, there are a couple of writings on the experiences of these endangered labor women, which would be interesting to incorporate how these people also mattered, taken as labor. Any final questions, Landry, Lane? Yeah.
Students represent.
Yes. Is a global China studies.
The only thing I can think of, I'm wondering what initially drew you to explore themes of hospitality in maritime heritage.
Sorry, say this.
What
Ah,
what initially?
It's a very good question and a very important one. So when I started looking at the Maritime Silk Road, one of the first places where I went in a lot of the communities where I traveled is museum exhibits. I wanted to see what's represented as kind of a public knowledge about the maritime history of places. And what was striking to me everywhere, except for one place, was that there were no images of women whatsoever. And the reason why I understood that there are no images of women was when I went to Kochi, very prominently, there was a mural of a woman selling peppers. So I told myself, wait a second, why is it that I don't see women anywhere else? Whereas here's a woman selling peppers, not as a slave person, but clearly, at least in this mural, she was just a very happy seller of pepper. So this is how I started understanding and looking into these matrilineal communities, which were sprinkled all across the Indian Ocean world. And a lot of the archives talk about how all the trade interactions were happening with the women. And this is how I connected it to this idea of hospitality and how actually, in order to go anywhere. Oh, sorry, there was one more thing in the Scotchy exhibit. I didn't include it here. Maybe you remember this. I've shown it in other presentations. There is a very nice figure of Vasco da Gama being one of the first Portuguese to go to India, looking completely disheveled with a very long beard. His clothes are raggedy. He has a horrible hat. Clearly, he's kind of stepping out of a boat into a nice community, welcoming community. So again, this is what people looked like when they arrived on a coast, and somebody had to take care of them. So this is how I started thinking about hospitality.
One other thing, in the research you have done so far, have you found anything connecting men in history to hospitality?
Men?
Yeah.
Yeah, very good question. Yeah, I can never forget you, Tansen. Well, you see, that's the thing, right? Especially if you read European philosophy, European philosophical tradition, which suddenly remembers hospitality with Kant, with Immanuel Kant, right? Where this idea of hosting a person becomes very important because otherwise the Europeans will just get killed when they travel around, right? And so the hospitality tradition that comes from Kantian philosophy, where you have to accommodate the stranger, the stranger has the right to be accepted in a community and to be given protection, all of this thing, this Kantian hospitality, which is then developed by Derrida also, is a very masculine type of hospitality, right? So the stranger is a male, the host is a male, all across all of the hospitality writings of the European philosophical tradition. So this is also a little bit what I'm pushing against, because they were not making the food in the house, for sure. Kant didn't get the message.
I fear it's going to turn into a psychology debate. So
I go first? Okay. So thank you so much for your research. It's pretty interesting. And I can actually relate to it because I'm working on a research asking who is a port worker. And I'm trying to expound the boundaries, or rather expand the boundaries of the people who work in ports and in shipping beyond the boundaries of the port. Yeah. So, and my question to you is, from what I'm getting, what you're saying is that people who are involved in the maritime activity go beyond the shipping and the port. I don't know if that's what you are also implying, because if you're trying to go into the household to understand who's been cooking, who's not been cooking, and how do they assist in shipping, or even in the maritime industry. So is it that your understanding is like the labor goes beyond the port area? And how far in does that go? Then my second question is about what's your period? What period are you looking at? Are you do you have a scope? Is it so when you say historical, so like between which years to which years? And so the third question is about I don't know if in the past that whether we had the seafarers welfare centers, but now we have the seafarers welfare centers. We have also the port chaplains in the seafarers welfare centers. Are you also looking at that when trying to look at care and hospitality? Yeah, that's all.
These are great questions. Let me briefly speak to the welfare. I know a little bit of the Chinese story around welfare, and The Chinese story around welfare is was coming a lot through kind of the traditional societies. So different ethnic groups had their own traditional societies. And for example, if you go to Penang, maybe even in Singapore, you will see still some of the houses of these traditional societies where a lot of the maritime travelers would go there. They will get food, they will get jobs, they will get clothing. This is how they will connect to the local community. So a very established system for the Chinese maritime travelers. And of course, all of them were worshiping Mazu as part of that. On the labor part, so yes, there is the component of who will make the food and who will cook for the mariners and things like that. But it's not just that, right? So a lot of the people who were traveling, they would, for example, want to buy spices, right? To buy the spice, there is an entire supply chain of, procuring making the spice, the pepper, taking it to the coast, selling it to the sailors, to the traders. A lot of these networks were actually organized through the support of women, right? And a lot of the women were involved in this, even for the simple reason that a lot of the men were on the sea, right? So the agricultural supply chains were very much driven by or depended very much on women, on the labor of women. And that would go from the mountain to the coast, right? So we're not just talking about the port environment itself, we were talking connection to the inner lands. And so it's a very kind of extended network where you can, and there are a lot of scholars working on this, where you cannot think about the maritime just as a maritime, right? It's always connected to the internal community interactions.
And that connection was not always just horizontal, it was also vertical. So the pepper cultivators were actually women. They needed their fingers to cultivate the pepper which were in the hills. So there's a vertical on the hills connections as well. So it goes horizontal within the hinterland and vertical in the mountains or hills. So every port had a hill, and that's how they identified many of these ports in Chinese records. But I think the other thing, Marina, perhaps the last thing, uh, also these traders, sojourning traders, married local women, the whole Peranakan thing, right? I mean, who took care of their businesses when they were not there. So the agency of women can be looked from that side as well, not just hospitality, but as managers of the businesses when the guy is traveling, right? So it's the whole Nonia community develops there. So the Peranakan thing. So I think the agency is there. It's just perhaps a problem of us not looking at the agency of women in different ways: hospitality, labor, business management. Simone, perhaps that's the connection between what you do, Simone, and perhaps the earlier woman in many different parts of Southeast Asia taking care of businesses for the traveling traders. And Simone, that's the question I'm asking. I'm asking how Changhe became a god. That's what she wrote in Indonesia. Any other question?
Yeah, and just to add to the point of men mariners marrying into or connecting to the women, as soon as the Portuguese understood that by having familial relationship with the women, they will get into these trading networks. They started kind of integrating themselves, having children with the local women, because that was a way into the networks themselves. Right? This is how they developed trust with the local communities. And there are a lot of stories of these Portuguese and Dutch children of kind of mixed marriage and their status in these communities as well.
Okay, Kevin, you didn't ask question, but we should all thank Marina for the wonderful talk and encouraging us to look into the female gender aspect of the Indian Ocean world. Thank you.